What if the person you trusted most in the world was planning your destruction? Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Chronicles HQ. I'm Weichu, and today we're diving into one of the most shocking cases of betrayal and deception I've ever covered. This isn't just a story about infidelity or heartbreak. This is about a calculated, cold-blooded scheme that shattered an innocent woman's life in the most unimaginable way. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains disturbing content involving manipulation, violence, and betrayal. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you're sensitive to these topics, please consider whether you want to continue watching. Now, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this need to be told, and your support helps us bring you the most compelling true crime content on YouTube. Let me paint you a picture of loneliness that millions of people can relate to. Margaret Thompson, 56 years old, had been navigating the world of online dating for 3 years after her divorce. Like so many women her age, she found herself in that difficult space where starting over feels both necessary and terrifying. Margaret worked as a nurse at a local hospital, a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others, who understood pain and healing better than most. She lived alone in a modest apartment, her children grown and living their own lives. The quiet evenings stretched endlessly, filled only with the blue glow of her television and the occasional phone call from her daughter. Then, 6 months ago, she met David Richardson on a dating app. David was 52, recently divorced, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in building something real with her. Their first video call lasted 3 hours. Their first date extended well into the night, with neither wanting it to end. For Margaret, David represented something she thought she'd never find again: genuine connection. He was attentive, remembering small details about her day, sending good morning texts that made her smile before her feet even hit the floor. He talked about future plans, weekend getaways, and meeting each other's families. But here's what Margaret didn't know, and what makes this story so devastating. David Richardson had never been divorced. He was very much married to Linda Richardson, and they had been planning something sinister from the very beginning. As their relationship progressed, Margaret noticed certain patterns that, in hindsight, should have been red flags. David was only available at specific times. He never invited her to his place, always suggesting they meet at restaurants or her apartment. When she asked to see where he lived, he claimed he was in the middle of renovating and didn't want her to see the mess. But love, or what Margaret believed was love, has a way of making us rationalize the irrational. She told herself he was just private, maybe a little self-conscious about his living situation. After all, he was so attentive in every other way. Meanwhile, David would return home each night to Linda, his wife of 23 years. They would discuss Margaret like she was a character in a movie they were watching together. Linda knew about every date, every text message, every intimate moment Margaret shared with her husband. You see, this wasn't a case of a cheating husband hiding an affair. This was something far more calculated and cruel. David and Linda had been watching Margaret's online dating profile for weeks before David made contact. They studied her photos, her interests, her posts about loneliness, and hoping to find love again. Linda later admitted to police that they specifically targeted women in their 50s who seemed isolated, who posted about being recently divorced or widowed. They weren't looking for money. Margaret was a nurse, not wealthy. They weren't looking for anything she possessed, except perhaps the one thing she valued most: her ability to trust and love again. The invitation. After 6 months of what Margaret believed was a loving relationship, David extended an invitation that filled her with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. He wanted her to come to his house for dinner, a milestone she had been hoping for since their third date. "I want you to see where I live," he told her over the phone, his voice warm and convincing. "I've been working on the renovations, and I think you'll love what I've done with the place. Plus, I want to cook for you for once, instead of always going out." Margaret spent 3 days planning what to wear. She bought a bottle of wine from the local shop, the kind she remembered David mentioning he enjoyed. She even bought a small plant as a housewarming gift, despite not knowing if the renovations were complete. On the evening of March 15th, Margaret drove the 40 minutes to David's address, an address she was getting for the first time. The house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with well-maintained lawns and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that suggested happy families and stable lives. As she walked up the driveway, carrying her wine and her small gift, Margaret felt a flutter of excitement. This felt like a real step forward in their relationship. Finally, she would see how David lived, get a glimpse into his private world. She had no idea that Linda Richardson was watching her from the upstairs window, or that this invitation was the culmination of a plan that had been months in the making. The trap springs. David answered the door with his usual charming smile, taking the wine and commenting on what a thoughtful choice it was. The house was beautiful, recently renovated indeed, with modern fixtures and warm lighting that created an inviting atmosphere. "You have a lovely home," Margaret said as David gave her a tour of the downstairs. Everything seemed perfect, normal, exactly what she had hoped to see. But as they moved toward the kitchen, Margaret heard footsteps upstairs. She paused, looking up at the ceiling with a confused expression. "Oh," David said, his tone suddenly different, less warm. "That's Linda, my wife." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt her stomach drop, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Wife? But he was divorced. He had shown her papers, talked about custody arrangements with his children, shared stories about the pain of his marriage ending. Before Margaret could speak, before she could even fully absorb what was happening, Linda Richardson appeared at the top of the stairs. She wasn't surprised to see Margaret there. She was calm, collected, almost businesslike in her demeanor. "Hello, Margaret," Linda said, walking slowly down the stairs. "We need to talk." Margaret later told police that this was the moment she realized she was in real danger. It wasn't just the presence of a wife she didn't know existed. It was the way both David and Linda were looking at her, like predators who had successfully cornered their prey. "I should go," Margaret said, backing toward the door. But David moved to block her path, his charming facade completely gone now. "You're not going anywhere," Linda said. "Not yet. Not until we're finished with you." The night builds to dramatic crescendo. What happened next was a calculated act of psychological and physical torture that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Linda and David had planned this evening down to the smallest detail, and Margaret's arrival at their home was the beginning of what they called the finale. According to Margaret's testimony and the evidence later presented in court, the couple spent the next 4 hours systematically destroying her sense of reality and self-worth. They revealed that their entire relationship had been a lie, not just David's marital status, but everything. The stories he had told her about his life, his interests, even his name. David Richardson wasn't even his real name. His actual name was Daniel Rivers, and he and Linda had been running similar schemes for over 2 years. Linda showed Margaret photographs, pictures of her leaving her apartment, going to work, meeting David at restaurants. They had been watching her, documenting her movements, treating her life like a research project. "You made this so easy," Linda told her. Posting about being lonely online, talking about how much you wanted to find love again. You practically gift-wrapped yourself for us. But the psychological torture was only the beginning. When Margaret tried to leave, tried to reach for her phone to call for help, the situation escalated into physical violence that would leave her hospitalized for 3 days. The details of what David and Linda did to Margaret that night are difficult to recount, but they're important to understand because they show the depths of human cruelty that can hide behind seemingly normal facades. They took turns humiliating her, forcing her to read aloud the text messages she had sent David over the past 6 months. Messages full of vulnerability and growing love. They made her listen to recorded phone conversations, including intimate moments she thought were private between 2 people falling in love. The brutal reality. The physical assault began when Margaret made a desperate attempt to reach the front door. David grabbed her, and what followed was a sustained attack that left Margaret with 2 broken ribs, extensive bruising, and a concussion that affected her memory for weeks afterward. But perhaps more devastating than the physical injuries was the psychological damage. Linda and David had methodically destroyed every happy memory Margaret had from their 6-month relationship. Every tender moment, every laugh they had shared, every time Margaret had felt grateful to have found love again, all of it was revealed to be part of an elaborate game. The worst part, Margaret later told a victim's advocate, wasn't the physical pain. It was realizing that someone could hate you so much without even knowing you, that they could spend months studying how to hurt you in the most effective way possible. As the hours passed, Margaret began to understand that Linda and David weren't planning to let her leave. They had discussed what to do with her, speaking about her as if she weren't there, as if she were an object rather than a human being. Linda revealed that they had done this before, lured lonely women into fake relationships, then brought them to the house for what they called reality therapy. They showed Margaret videos on Linda's phone, recordings of other women who had been in Margaret's exact situation. "You all fall for the same things," Linda said. "You're all so desperate to be loved that you ignore obvious signs. You deserve what happens to you." The couple had turned the systematic emotional and physical abuse of vulnerable women into a twisted hobby, a way to feel powerful and superior. They fed off the pain and confusion of their victims, treating human suffering like entertainment. The escape, Margaret's survival, came down to a combination of luck, determination, and a mistake on her captor's part. Around 2 a.m., after nearly 6 hours of torture, Linda and David began to argue about what to do next. David wanted to drive Margaret somewhere remote and abandon her, forcing her to find her own way home as a final humiliation. Linda wanted to continue the psychological torture until morning, then release her with threats about what would happen if she went to the police. During their argument, they made a crucial error. They left Margaret alone in the living room while they went to the kitchen to discuss their options. Margaret's purse, which contained her car keys, was on a table near the front door. Despite her injuries, despite the concussion that made thinking clearly almost impossible, Margaret knew this might be her only chance. She forced herself to stand, grabbed her purse, and stumbled toward the door. The deadbolt was unlocked, another mistake that probably saved her life. She managed to get outside and into her car, starting it just as David burst through the front door. Margaret later said she didn't remember the drive home, didn't remember anything clearly until she woke up in her own apartment the next afternoon, her body screaming with pain and her face so swollen she didn't recognize herself in the bathroom mirror. It took her 2 more days to work up the courage to call the police. She was terrified that Linda and David would carry out their threats, that no one would believe her story, that somehow she would be blamed for what had happened to her. But Margaret was stronger than her attackers had calculated. She was a nurse, someone who understood trauma and recovery. She knew that staying silent would only give Linda and David the power to hurt others. The investigation. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to Margaret's case, and from the moment she heard the story, she knew they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple assault. The calculated nature of the deception, the months of planning, the evidence of other victims, this was a pattern of predatory behavior that needed to be stopped. The investigation revealed the true scope of Linda and David's crimes. Their real names were Daniel and Linda Rivers, and they had been married for 23 years. Daniel worked in IT, which gave him the technical skills to create fake online profiles and manage multiple fake identities. Linda worked part-time as a real estate agent, which provided them with access to empty houses they could use for their schemes. Over the course of 3 years, they had targeted at least 12 women, all between the ages of 45 and 60, all recently divorced or widowed, all seeking companionship through online dating platforms. The couple had turned predation into a science. They kept detailed files on each victim, psychological profiles, personal information gathered from social media, notes about vulnerabilities they could exploit. They had rating systems for different types of manipulation tactics and kept scorecards of how effectively they could break down each woman's defenses. Police found video recordings of at least 6 other attacks, similar to what Margaret had endured. The Rivers had been documenting their crimes, treating the suffering they caused like a collection of trophies. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery of their graduation plan, a detailed outline for escalating their attacks to include more serious physical harm and eventually murder. The trial of Daniel and Linda Rivers became a landmark case in the prosecution of online predators who target vulnerable adults. Margaret's decision to testify was incredibly brave, considering the psychological trauma she had endured and the public nature of the proceedings. During her testimony, Margaret spoke not just about her own experience, but about the broader issue of predators who exploit people's desire for connection and love. She had spent months in therapy, working through not just the physical and emotional trauma, but also the shame and self-blame that many victims experience. "I want other women to know that this wasn't our fault," Margaret said from the witness stand. "These people are professionals at manipulation. They study us, they practice on us, they perfect their techniques by destroying our lives. We can't blame ourselves for falling victim to people who have made victimization their life's work." The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the Rivers' systematic targeting and abuse of vulnerable women. The defense attempted to argue that the encounters were consensual adult relationships that had gone wrong, but the evidence of premeditation and the sheer number of victims made this argument impossible to sustain. Linda Rivers showed no remorse throughout the trial, often smirking during victim impact statements and rolling her eyes when Margaret described her injuries. Daniel Rivers attempted to portray himself as being manipulated by his wife, but his own recordings and writings revealed him to be an eager participant in their crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including kidnapping, assault, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Daniel Rivers to 25 years in prison and Linda Rivers to 22 years, calling their crimes a calculated campaign of terror against vulnerable women seeking human connection. The aftermath and healing, 25 to 20. Margaret's journey toward healing has been long and difficult, but also inspiring in its demonstration of human resilience. She spent 6 months in intensive therapy, working through the complex trauma of being systematically deceived and attacked by someone she had grown to love and trust. "The hardest part wasn't the physical healing," Margaret explains. "It was learning to trust my own judgment again. These people had convinced me that I was stupid, desperate, that I deserved what happened to me. Recovery meant learning to see myself the way I really am, not the way they wanted me to see myself." Margaret has become an advocate for other victims of online predators, working with law enforcement and victim services organizations to help identify and support people who have been targeted by similar schemes. She has helped establish new protocols for investigating cases involving fake online relationships and has testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults from online predators. Perhaps most remarkably, Margaret has not allowed her experience to close her off from human connection entirely. After 2 years of therapy and healing, she began cautiously dating again, this time with much stronger boundaries and a support system of friends and family who help her verify the authenticity of potential partners. "I refuse to let them steal my ability to love and be loved," she says. "That would mean they won, and I'm not going to let them win." Margaret's story offers important lessons for anyone navigating online dating, especially those in vulnerable life transitions like divorce, widowhood, or major life changes. The warning signs that Margaret now recognizes include partners who are only available at specific times, who avoid video calls or meeting in person for extended periods, who seem to know just a little too much about your vulnerabilities, and who push for emotional intimacy very quickly. Experts recommend several safety measures for online dating. Always meet in public places for first meetings. Verify identity through social media and other sources. Trust your instincts when something feels off. And maintain connections with friends and family who can provide outside perspectives on new relationships. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story reminds us that predators specifically target our most human needs, our desire for love, connection, and understanding. There is nothing shameful about wanting these things, and there is nothing shameful about being deceived by people who have made deception their specialty. If you take nothing else from my story, Margaret says, take this. The problem isn't that we trust too much. The problem is that there are people in this world who exploit our trust. The solution isn't to become cynical and closed off. The solution is to be aware, to be careful, but to keep our hearts open to the possibility of real love. Conclusion. The case of Daniel and Linda Rivers represents something far more sinister than typical online dating scams or even domestic violence. It reveals the existence of predators who have turned the systematic psychological and physical destruction of vulnerable people into a hobby, a source of entertainment, and a way to feel powerful. Margaret Thompson's courage in coming forward and testifying helped put two dangerous predators behind bars and potentially save countless other women from experiencing similar trauma. But her story also serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and our capacity to heal from even the most calculated cruelty. As we conclude today's video, I want to remind you that if you or someone you know has experienced something similar to what Margaret went through, help is available. I've included links to victim support organizations in the description below. Margaret's story is ultimately one of survival, courage, and the refusal to let evil people steal our capacity for love and trust. It reminds us to be careful, to be aware, but never to stop believing in the possibility of genuine human connection. Thank you for watching, and please remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like Margaret's need to be told, and your support helps ensure that we can continue bringing you these important true crime cases. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, trust your instincts. They might just save your life.